Robin Rose. In this video, we'll be exploring how the brain controls voluntary muscle movement, beginning with the first initiation in the cortex, all the way to the contraction of the muscle. We'll explain the upper and lower motor neuron pathways, talk through decussation, and touch on some neurodegenerative disorders. Let's get to it. Voluntary movement starts in the primary motor cortex of the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe of the brain, this red region on my model right here. This area of the brain helps to initiate muscle action, and other nearby regions help to plan out those actions. The premotor cortex, this pinkish area and below on my model of the brain here, assists with planning out movement from visual cues. For example, if you're driving, you see a red light and you brake, your action, the braking, is being planned out by this region here based on the visual cue of seeing the red light. The supplementary motor area, or the SMA, the kind of like superior central orange region of the model here, just in front of the premotor cortex, is responsible for planning and sequencing internally guided movements. For example, playing a piece of music on the piano from memory. The SMA helps to plan and sequence those movements without the guide of external visual cues, such as sheet music. The basal ganglia, which are found deep in the neocortex of the brain here, regulate initiation and inhibition. For example, if you're in a meeting and you want to say something but need to wait for someone else to finish talking, they regulate the action of waiting to speak until it's appropriate and initiating the speech when it is. Once the movement has been decided, the signal then enters the upper motor neuron pathway. The upper motor neuron pathway carries the command from the brain, the cortex, into the spinal cord. Upper motor neurons begin in the primary motor cortex. They descend into the corona radiata, converge in the internal capsule, and travel down through the midbrains into the pons and the medulla oblongata. Decussation allows one brain hemisphere to control both the motor and sensory information on the contralateral side of the body by the crossing over of nerve fibers from one side of the central nervous system to the other. This happens at the pyramidal decussation, which is right about here on my model of the medulla oblongata on the right side of the brain. Then here we have a flip chart. We can consider this orange part here a cross section of the medulla oblongata. So if the nerve fibers on the right side here cross over to the left side of the spinal cord, that crossing over becomes lateral corticospinal tract. About 90% of nerve fibers cross over in this way, and those nerve fibers are responsible for the more fine muscle movement, such as drawing lines on a flip chart or buttoning up a shirt. The remaining 10% of muscle fibers do not cross over. They remain on the ipsilateral side between the brain and the spinal cord. Those muscles form the anterior cortical spinal tract, and those fibers are responsible for the trunk and proximal muscles. For example, the muscles that you use to maintain an upright posture or to stabilize the shoulders when doing a push-up. Upper motor neurons terminate in the spinal cord where they synapse with the lower motor neurons. The lower motor neuron pathway begins in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. It exits out through the ventral roots and travels via peripheral nerves to specific skeletal muscles. Once we get to the neuromuscular junction, the motor neuron, pictured here in orange, then releases acetylcholine into the muscle fiber, pictured in red right below. The acetylcholine binds to receptors in the muscle fiber, these little purple spots here, and that binding then triggers a muscle contraction. That contraction is the end of the lower motor neuron pathway. It's constantly being refined by sensory feedback. For example, as you go to grab your mug of coffee, proprioceptors in your muscles and joints send real-time feedback to your brain about your arm's position, speed, and the force that you're using. I'm gonna swap out my coffee for my model of the brain right here again to show you the cerebellum. This area back here, it plays a key role in comparing your actual movement to what the brain intended. So it ensures that as you reach for your coffee, your hand does not drift off course, that you're not applying too much force, and if you are doing so, it makes corrections mid-movement to ensure that it is smooth and accurate. A reminder how in section 1, we discussed how the basal ganglia, the cluster of nuclei deep in the brain here, help to regulate inhibitions and inhibitions. In terms of sensory feedback and modulation, they help to suppress any unnecessary movements that may interfere with your intended goal. For example, as I go to grab my cup of coffee, it prevents my fingers from tensing too early and ensures I wait until my hands actually touch the mug in order to grab it and complete my intended action. These systems work to ensure that even a simple task, such as picking up your mug of coffee, is a seamless, fluid, and efficient movement. Damage or degeneration in motor-related cortical regions can impair voluntary movement and speech. One condition that illustrates this is a form of dementia called primary progressive aphasia. Primary progressive aphasia is a neurodegenerative disorder that affects the language-dominant areas of the brain, primarily the left, frontal, and temporal lobes. This disrupts the motor planning for speech, leading to the apraxia of speech, or the breakdown of the precise coordination of movement needed for speaking. Let's recap what we learned in this video. First, various areas of the brain, including the motor cortex, the premotor area, and the cerebellum, are responsible for planning and coordinating movement. Second, the upper motor neuron pathway carries commands from the brain down into the spinal cord. Third, in the upper motor neuron pathway, 90% of nerve fibers desiccate in the medulla, meaning they move to the contralateral side of the central nervous system, which explains why oftentimes one hemisphere of the brain controls the contralateral side of the body. Fourth, we learned that the lower motor neuron pathway takes those commands from the spinal cord into the muscle fibers and initiates a muscle contraction. Fifth, we learned that movement is refined by sensory and proprioceptive feedback sent back into the nervous system. And lastly, we learned how disorders like primary progressive aphasia that cause cortical degeneration can affect the motor system. My name is Robin Rose. I give Professor Joanne Caban permission to post this video to the Science Learning Center and BMCC Open Lab, and I understand that it may be shared publicly.